All right, the first thing we're going to talk about in this section is the for loop, which we use for repeating a set of instructions. So imagine we want to print the numbers 1 to 5. Here's one way to do this. We can use cout to print 1, followed by an handle. Then we can duplicate this to print 2, 3, 4, and so on. Now, this is not the ideal way to write code because what if we wanted to print the numbers 1 to 1 million? Then we would have to write 1 million lines of code just to do this. There must be a better way, right? This is where we use loops. Using a loop, we can repeat one or more instructions. For example, using a loop, we can repeat this instruction, but instead of printing 1, we're going to print the value of a variable like I, but in each repetition, we're going to increment I by 1. Let me show you how. So in this lesson, we're going to use the for loop, but we also have other types of loops that you're going to learn about in this section. So we start off by typing the for keyword. Then in parentheses, we type 3 expressions. The first expression is for declaring our loop or counter variable. Using this variable, we can determine how many times we want to repeat something. So here we can declare a variable like I and initialize it to 0. Now we could call this variable anything, but it's quite conventional to call this variable I, okay? Next, we terminate this expression using a semicolon and then type the second expression, which is a Boolean expression or a condition that determines when this loop will terminate. So here we can say I less than 5. So as long as I is less than 5, this loop is going to get executed. Then we terminate this using a semicolon. And next we type an expression that determines how I is going to change after each repetition. So here we can say after each repetition, we want to increment I by 1. So we can say I equals I plus 1. Or we can use the increment operator to increment I by 1, okay? Now we press enter, and here we type the statement that we want to repeat. We can have one or more statements. If we have multiple statements, we have to wrap them in braces, okay? So here we're going to print I followed by handle. Now in this case, because we have a single statement, the braces are unnecessary, okay? Let's run our program and see what we get. So we get the numbers 0 to 4. So using only 2 lines, we could print the numbers 0 to 4. If we wanted to print the numbers 1 to 1 million, all we had to do was change this number to 1 million, okay? Now let me explain how exactly these 2 lines get executed. So first, our loop variable or our counter variable is initialized to 0. Then the loop condition is evaluated. So 0 is less than 5, so the body of the loop, which is this line, gets executed, and that's why we see the number 0 on the terminal. Then at the end of this repetition or this iteration, I is incremented by 1. So I becomes 1. Then the control goes back to the beginning of the loop. So the condition is evaluated. Now 1 is less than 5, so the execution continues. So now we see 1 on the terminal, and once again, at the end of the second iteration, I is incremented by 1. So this process keeps repeating until I becomes 5. When I becomes 5, this condition is no longer valid because 5 is not less than 5. That's when the control moves out of this loop. So when we run this program, the largest number we see is 4. If we want to see 5 as well, we have to change our loop condition to I less than or equal to 5. So as long as this condition is valid, our loop is going to get executed. Take a look. So now run. Now we see the numbers 0 to 5. Now, what if we don't want to see 0? Well, we can initialize I to 1. Now, take a look. We see the numbers 1 to 5. Now, what if you want to see the numbers in reverse order? Well, we can start from 5 and change our loop condition to say, as long as I is greater than 0, then decrement I by 1 in each iteration. So now when we run the program, we see the numbers 5 to 1. So the possibilities are endless, okay? Now, let's do something more interesting. So I'm going to add braces here and then move this line up here. Now, instead of printing each number, let's say we only want to print the odd numbers. So here we can type an if statement and check the remainder of division of I by 2. So we say I modulus 2, which returns the remainder of division by 2. If this value is not equal to 0, that means I is an odd number, right? So then we can print I on the terminal. Now, if we run the program, we only see the odd numbers from 5 to 1. Beautiful. Now, here's a great exercise for you, which is also a common interview question. So I want you to write a program and ask the user for a positive number. Then print the factorial of that number. Now, in case you're not familiar with factorial, here are a few examples. Factorial of 0 is 1. Factorial of 1 is 1 as well. Factorial of 2 equals 1 times 2. And factorial of 3 is 1 times 2 times 3. So spend 5 minutes on this exercise, then come back see my solution. All right, first we need to ask the user to enter a positive number. So cout, enter a positive number. Next, we declare a variable and use cin to read a number. Now here we need to check to see if this number is negative or not. So if number is less than 0, we want to print an error. So we can print error, number is not positive. Now otherwise, we want to calculate the factorial of the number and print it. So here we're going to add braces because we're going to have multiple statements. Now to calculate the factorial, we need to declare a variable called factorial. And I'm going to initialize this to 1 in case the number that the user enters is 0 or 1. In that case, factorial is 1 anyway. But if the number is greater than or equal to 2, then the factorial of that number equals the multiplication of all the previous numbers and that number itself. So here we can use a for loop to multiply this variable by all the previous numbers up to 1. So we declare a loop variable called I, we initialize it to 1. Now, as long as I is less than or equal to the number that the user entered, we're going to repeat this loop, and after each iteration, we're going to increment I by 1. Now, in each iteration, we're going to take the factorial and multiply it by I, our loop variable. Now, we can simplify this code and use the compound assignment operator. So factorial times equals I. That's better, okay? Now finally, we print the factorial of number is factorial, okay? Let's run the program and see what happens. So if we enter a negative value, we get an error, beautiful. If we enter 0, we see 1 because we initialized factorial to 1. Now similarly, if we enter 1, we get 1 as well. If we enter 2, we get 2 because 2 times 1 is 2, right? If we enter 3, we get 6. So this is the simplest way to implement this logic. I just want to highlight something here before we finish this lesson. If number is 0 or 1, this condition will never evaluate to true, so this loop will never get executed. That is why we print the initial value of factorial, which is 1. But if the number is 2 or larger, then this loop is going to get executed at least once.